The $10 trillion secret. What happens if the Strait of Gibraltar closes for good? The horns never stop. Tankers idle in a grid from Tangier to Cadiz, while AIS screens paint a static mosaic. In Algeciras, a harbor pilot stares at a tide chart that no longer predicts anything. In Barcelona, a hospital pharmacist opens an email. The antibiotic shipment is delayed, substitutes are rationed, waiting on the strait. The Mediterranean exhales through one gate. Today, it's stuck. To understand why a rough-lipped 280 meters down can jam a sea and cost the world trillions, we need to go back to the narrow cut between continents, the physics that feeds a basin, and the fault lines waiting underneath. The gate that feeds a sea. Stand on Europa Point and look east. The water looks like one surface, but two rivers slide past each other in the same channel. On top, a lens of lighter Atlantic water pours in, refreshing the Mediterranean surface. Below, a denser, saltier layer, water that's evaporated and sunk inside the basin, pushes out to the Atlantic. They don't mix much. They shear and trade momentum, like two conveyor belts brushing shoulders. The whole system depends on a simple imbalance. The Mediterranean loses more water to evaporation than it gains from rivers and rain. It survives because the Atlantic tops it up. Now narrow that connection to just 14 kilometers at its tightest pinch and raise a rocky step, the Camarinal Sill near the western mouth. That sill is the gate. The lower conveyor must climb it to escape. Most days it does, but just barely. The strait runs on a knife's edge. A small change in depth, bottom texture, or the density of the layers can flip it from flowing cleanly to churning in place. Here's where the numbers matter without drowning you in jargon. The dense layer wants to slide out. As it approaches the sill, it speeds up. If the crest is clear and smooth, it crests and spills west as a continuous tongue, carrying salt and cold into the Atlantic. If the crest gets roughened by a fresh drape of sand, a slump of mud, a tangle of boulders, the flow loses energy to turbulence. The tongue detaches, spins eddies, and wastes power in place. Pressure builds on the Mediterranean side, but if the losses across the sill grow faster, the actual transport drops. Think of it like a clogged filter. More push behind it doesn't mean more water through it. Could roughen the crest. Geology offers options, none of them dramatic at the surface. The Gibraltar arc flexes slowly, tiny earthquakes rattle the seabed. A slope failure can slide a patch of sediment a few meters, draping the sill in fine grains that behave like velvet under current. A storm train can drive sand from shallower shoals into deeper notches. Even without a discrete event, months of strong internal waves, subsurface pulses that break like underwater surf, can rearrange bed forms. You won't see it from a ferry, you'll feel it in the currents. Meanwhile, ships don't care about density layers. They care about schedules and fuel. About 120,000 vessels thread this gate each year. NATO planners pencil that number into exercises, insurers price it into premiums. Oil and gas tankers, box ships loaded with everything from phones to frozen fish, feeder vessels that knit together North African ports and European hubs, they all inherit the strait's mood. If the lower layer stumbles, the upper layer adjusts too. The surface inflow can strengthen in patches, whip up shear, and set up standing waves that throw pilots off their rhythm. Add fog, add crosswinds, add traffic separation schemes that assume a certain background flow, and suddenly a narrow margin shrinks. But ships are the visible part. The invisible part is why the strait matters to anyone who doesn't live within sight of the rock. The Mediterranean's biology and chemistry are tuned to that two-layer exchange. Atlantic inflow dilutes surface salinity, tamps down heat in summer, and feeds the top of the food web with nutrients stirred up by sheared layers. The dense outflow is the basin's exhale, how it sheds salt and recycles deep water. When the gate throttles, the basin holds more of its own salt and heat. That doesn't announce itself on a single beach day. It creeps into spawning calendars, oxygen levels, and the stress budgets of species already squeezed by warming. Now layer in human rules that have tightened around the sea. Since May 1, 2025, the Mediterranean is an emission control area for sulfur. Ships here burn fuel with a maximum sulfur content of 0.1% or run scrubbers. It's a win for lungs from Marseille to Alexandria. It also means fewer easy fuel swaps or detours to burn dirtier blends outside the line. Fewer EU rules push cleaner operations at berth. Good policies, but they narrow flexibility when the gate acts up. Compliance doesn't cause the jam, it limits sloppy workarounds when time runs long. Geopolitics knots the margins too. Gibraltar's border has eased after a June 2025 framework, with dual controls at the port and airport to keep daily life fluid. That stability matters when you need pilots, tugs, and workers moving without friction. Across the water, Spain and Morocco talk tunnels and integration, even as pressure swells around Ceuta and Melilla. These aren't distractions. They're the background hum that determines how fast a region pivots when a physical choke tightens. Meanwhile, fisheries ride the knife's edge already. The Mediterranean is warming faster than the global average. Over 60% of Western Med stocks are overfished. July 2025 set sea temperature records around 26.9 degrees Celsius. In that context, the Strait's job isn't abstract. It bleeds off salt, tempers extremes, and keeps the basin's metabolism from running hot. Throttle the exhale, and the body runs a fever. Here's the quiet irony. For millions, the Strait is a horizon line, a place to watch ships and sunsets. For the basin, it's a valve. When it's open, nobody notices. When it sticks, everything connected to this sea, from satellite tracks to supermarket shelves, feels the drag. And the fix isn't a tugboat. It's understanding a rocky step in the dark and how close the system lives to its limits. How the Strait could close, hazards, not hype. Start with what it's not. It's not a cartoon cork popping into the seabed. It's not a landslide the size of a city parking itself in the channel in one afternoon. The Strait closes the way gears seize. Friction rises, heat builds, and then one-day motion that looks steady slows enough to matter for everything connected to it. Three families of hazards carry weight here: geologic slips, sediment mechanics, and internal wave dynamics. None need a headline to shift the gate. The geologic part moves in millimeters and seconds. The Gibraltar arc is still adjusting. Small earthquakes tick across fault lines that lace the sill. Most barely register ashore. At depth, the jolt they deliver can wake a sleepy slope. A patch of sand and mud that's held its angle under steady current can liquefy for minutes and go for a ride, spreading a thin sheet across the crest. You don't need a wall of debris. You need a few tens of centimeters of fresh, mobile sediment in the wrong place, like velvet laid over a stair. A storm train is another quiet sculptor. Strong westerlies push swell through the strait. Bursts of levante stack water and shear. On sounders, you'd see bed forms migrate, dunes and ripples marching a little faster, then stalling as they encounter the sill's rougher texture. A single winter can carry enough sand from the margins to drape low spots. Add a year of internal waves breaking on the slope, underwater surf rolling up from the density jump and collapsing into turbulence, and the crest can gain a new skin. It looks like a dull coat of paint on a rock. It behaves like a break on flow. Then there's the dynamic hazard you can't hold in your hand. The Strait breathes with tides not just at the surface, but inside, across the boundary where lighter Atlantic water rides over denser Mediterranean water. Those tides generate internal waves that run east, reflect, break, and mix. In normal years, that mixing is healthy. It stirs nutrients and keeps layers honest. But internal waves also focus stress along the sill. Over months of strong events, they can rearrange microtopography, filling in small channels that mattered for the dense layer to stay attached as it climbed. Think of a runner losing traction on a gravelly ridge. The difference between cresting and slipping is the grip underfoot. None of this is theory for its own sake. It shows up as changes in the way water moves. The dense layer that usually pours west as a coherent tongue starts to shred into intermittent plumes. Eddies peel off the lee side and die in place instead of carrying salt out. The system tries to compensate. Pressure on the Mediterranean side inches up. The surface inflow thickens in stretches, squirrely enough to rock ships. Pilots in Algeciras feel their windows shrink. Captains wait for slack that never arrives exactly when their schedules expect it. AIS plots look normal until they don't. A few more slowdowns, a few more delays stacking like planes in a holding pattern. Here's where the human world meets the physics. In the first 30 days, nobody says closure. Port notices say adverse currents. schedules slip. Insurance whispers about higher risk windows. A Barcelona hospital pharmacy gets the email. An antibiotic shipment is delayed. Substitutes are rationed. Procurement calls suppliers and hears the same refrain waiting on the strait. In Tangier, a refrigerated truck idles longer. A driver does the math on diesel and lost hours. A Valencia exporter pays a premium to route through an Atlantic gateway. It arrives by rail 3 days late anyway. What could flip adverse into choked? A clustered run of small events. A moderate quake tickles a slope. A storm week follows, driving swell and wind through the axis. Internal waves ride the compounded density contrast and break hard on a crest that's just been draped with fresh sediment. The dense layer now hits a slightly shallower, rougher lip and detaches more often. You won't see a plume of mud on satellite. You'll see persistence, weeks where transport metrics at depth stay low, not just noisy. Instruments on the sill would read it first. Higher turbulence, more back and forth energy, less net westward push. Could a shipwreck do it? Ships stick to the surface lanes, their drafts barely scratch the upper layer. A wreck is a hazard to navigation, not a plug in the deep conveyor. Could a deliberate act mining the sill matter? In theory, yes. In practice, the dynamic environment and international attention make it an unlikely path. The real vulnerability is banal. A natural system that runs close to its limits most days has less slack when several small nudges arrive together. There's a legal and operational backdrop that sets response speed. The Mediterranean's new sulfur ECA rules don't cause friction, but they do narrow sloppy options, no cheap detours to burn dirty fuel while looping around timing. FuelEU rules enforce cleaner operations at berth. Again, good policy, but fewer corners to cut when you're hunting hours. Gibraltar's border framework eases labor and logistics, making it easier to surge pilots and tugs. Spain and Morocco's cooperation matters for any survey or stabilization work. NATO watches chokepoints, exercises test readiness to keep sea lines open, but no fleet can change the drag at 280 meters. None of this needs hype to land. The strait doesn't need to close like a door to behave like one that's swelling in its frame. A system built on 2 layers gliding past each other can hang on roughness and lose its clean exhale. When that happens, it's not an instant catastrophe, it's a long inconvenience that prices itself into everything. If it lasts, the inconvenience hardens into structure, costs, choices, and ecological stress that outlive the storm that nudged the first grains. The first 30 days, when ships stop and prices spike. Day 1 looks like weather, pilots call in adverse set, arrivals slip an hour, then 2, dispatchers redraw tug schedules. In Algeciras, a line of container ships holds offshore, engines turning slow circles to keep headway. In Tangier Med, cranes move, but stacks grow. Nobody uses the word closure. They say current windows. By day 3, the delays ripple into decisions. A major liner cancels an eastbound call to save fuel and time. Boxes destined for Geneva ride past and get dropped in Valencia instead. Freight forwarders text clients, reroute options available, expect additional fees. A trucker in Cadiz waits 6 hours for a container that never hits the yard. He burns diesel and eats the cost. The AIS map looks busy, but the choreography is off by a beat. Day 5, insurers step in. Underwriters tweak premiums for transits during the worst windows, a quiet surcharge that says risk rose without a headline. Bunker suppliers see a jump in demand for low-sulfur fuel as ships idle and reposition. Prices in the Western Med tick up a few dollars a ton. A ro-ro ferry skips a rotation to make the rest on time. Families miss connections and shrug it off as bad luck. Meanwhile, procurement teams don't shrug. The email hits a hospital pharmacy in Barcelona. An antibiotic shipment is delayed. The wholesaler suggests substitutes, those are rationed too. Pharmacists call every supplier and hear the same refrain waiting on the strait. A pediatrician writes a different brand on a script. The parent hands it to a pharmacist who whispers, "Come back tomorrow." They come back. Tomorrow is the same. Day 7, container lines announce blank sailings to reset schedules. A Valencia exporter pays to push 2 pallets by air. The quote has a pandemic echo. Belly capacity helps, but it's a thimble against a sea. Perishables reroute to Atlantic gateways, Lake Sos, Bilbao, La Havre, and ride rail into Europe. Rail paths aren't infinite. Drivers hit hour limits. Every workaround adds friction per box. Prices start to whisper the story. Fuel costs creep, then freight rates. A retailer's margin forecast turns a shade lighter. They add a temporary logistics surcharge without naming a cause. Garden variety electronics, fast fashion drops, seasonal decor, none are life or death, but they stack into the feeling that things are late. Shoppers don't read tide charts, they see out of stock. Day 10, the upper layer's mood creates its own complication. Stronger shear in patches makes pilotage tricky. 2 near misses in fog trigger stricter harbor windows. Caution is a tax paid in time. Port state control keeps enforcement steady. The new sulfur cap isn't a suggestion. Crews plan carefully. No one wants a fine on top of delays. Good rules, but fewer sloppy options. On day 12, the numbers move from logistics columns to headline writers' inboxes. A shipping index prints a spike for Western Med routes. Analysts call it temporary. Traders watch crude cargoes round Cape Verde to avoid uncertainty. That's hundreds of thousands of extra barrels burned by the fleet over weeks, priced into cargoes that land in Sicily and Marseille. Refiners nudge rack prices. The bump shows up at the pump, a few cents that everyone blames on something else. Fishermen feel it on shore first, not at sea. Ice costs more, diesel costs more. The buyers at auction offer less until volumes stabilize. A skipper in seat skips a day. Profit margins don't survive the trip. In Naples, a restaurant ices down a shorter list and takes bacala off the board. The chef says it's seasonal. It is. Day 15, a Catalan clinic misses a delivery window for reagents. Technicians reschedule tests and call patients. The spreadsheet's red cells trace back to one rough lip at depth. A factory in Turin adjusts a shift as parts wait in line, caught between a train slot and a customs appointment. Managers pull from pandemic playbooks, dual source, hold buffer stock, pay expedite fees. They can't do it for everything. On day 18, the political layer wakes up. A minister visits a port and promises support for logistics resilience. Press secretaries avoid the phrase "straight slowdown," but they circulate talking points about rerouting capacity and cooperation with neighbors. Gibraltar's smoother border helps surge pilots and crews. On a normal day, it's invisible. On a day like this, it trims minutes from tasks that eat hours when frayed. Rates keep climbing by inches. A home goods chain delays a sale. Margins are thin enough that the freight line matters. A small importer in Thessaloniki cancels a Christmas order in July. By arrival, it would be spring. Workers feel it as overtime on weekends and shorter shifts on Mondays. In Tangier, a refrigerated truck idles too long. The driver does the math and shuts the engine off. He doesn't have the luxury to bleed. Day 22, you can see the bleed map onto lives. A parent stands at a counter and hears "tomorrow" for the 3rd time. A fisherman's kid stares at a calm, empty wake and asks if the fish moved. A stevedore picks up an extra shift and misses dinner again. None of them say Camarinal Sill. They say late again. By day 30, it's a structure, not a story. Contracts carry new clauses. Surcharges have proper names. Inventories are rebuilt around slower, less certain flow. The ever-given taught boardrooms how a 6-day jam hits balance sheets. This teaches them how a geologic problem drains them, not by shock, but by leak. And still, offshore, the horns keep time. The Mediterranean starts to thirst. Hydrobalance crisis. The basin has always lived on a water budget with no slack. Evaporation outpaces rain and rivers. The only way the math works is the Atlantic topping it up through that narrow gate. Throttle the exhale at depth, and the inhale at the surface doesn't fully compensate. The ledger goes red slowly, then obviously. You see it first where salt licks the shore. In the Alboran, surface salinity edges up a hair. Nothing a swimmer would notice, everything a plankton bloom would. A spring phytoplankton pulse that usually follows a predictable mixing window arrives late and weaker. Sardine larvae that time their first feeding to that bloom hit thinner soup. A few days, mismatch doesn't kill a year class alone. Add heat stress and fishing pressure, and the small slips compound. Meanwhile, the surface layer grows more stratified. With less deep renewal and more heat trapped, the top tens of meters act like a tighter lid. Oxygen exchange slows. Nighttime respiration bites deeper. In a bay in Liguria, a fisherman checks his net and brings up a few fish gasping against a warm, low-oxygen layer that wasn't this thick last year. He tells himself it's a blip. His ledger tells him it is. The thirst shows up in salt budgets researchers keep in notebooks and servers. Instruments on moorings hum back data, a slightly saltier, slightly warmer top layer sliding east, a denser tongue at depth coughing instead of speaking in a full voice. Over months, that cough means salt that would have ridden west stays in the basin. The Mediterranean's deep reaches had been renewed by episodic winter convection in the Gulf of Lion and the Adriatic. Now, with the lid heavier and the exhale weak, those events struggle. A cold outbreak might still drive a convective punch, but it reaches shallower layers, reoxygenating less volume. Rivers don't ride to the rescue. The Ebro, the Rhone, the Po, they're already rationed by upstream demand and a warming climate. Summer flows dwindle, and when floods come, they come as pulses that flush fast and foul. The net annual balance stays the same or leans drier. Desalination plants on the coasts hum louder, drinking power and spitting brine back into a sea that's already thirstier. It's not the cause of the problem, it's how we live with it, shifting costs onto a body of water that can't file a complaint. The thirst becomes literal in aquifers near the coast. Saltwater intrusion edges upstream into groundwater used by farms. A farmer in Murcia tastes the well and shakes his head. The leaves on his lemon trees yellow for reasons that don't show up in a single storm. He buys more water, trucks it, and rewrites his season plan. Multiply that across thousands of small decisions, and the economy starts to pay a drought tax, even in years that didn't feel dry from the sky. In cities, it's subtler. Water managers extend conservation campaigns into months that used to be automatic. A utility raises tariffs a sliver to fund a new intake, a longer pipe, a better screen. The press release blames growth and climate. The spreadsheet has a line called marine salinity variability. It used to be noise. It isn't anymore. Ecologically, the pressure migrates along trophic lines. Posidonia meadows, already stressed by heat and light, now sit under a slightly saltier blanket longer into the season. The meadows don't vanish in a week. They thin, their edges fray, their nursery function weakens. Juvenile fish that hid in those blades find more open sand. Predators adjust. Catches lean towards species that thrive in warmer, saltier, simpler habitats, often smaller, often less valuable. Fishermen adapt until they can't. A skipper moves grounds. His father never had to. Fisheries managers track the drift on dashboards. The Western Med already had over 60% of stocks in the red for overfishing. Now, biological reference points wobble because the baseline environment shifts. Quotas written for yesterday's conditions feel wrong for today's, but politics lags physics. A council meeting runs late. The sea doesn't wait. The thirst pushes into chemistry headlines when oxygen minimums deepen and spread. Dead zones are Gulf of Mexico huge, but they don't have to be. A canyon off the Balearics that once channeled dense outflow pulses less often and with less punch. Benthic communities feel it first. Sponges, corals, crustaceans that can't swim to a better layer. Divers report a ledge gone still. Scientists nod and mark another site to revisit with instruments they barely have the funding to deploy. On the climate side, models suggest the basin's extra heat and salt retention feeds back into regional weather quietly. More evaporation from a warmer, saltier surface can load storms with moisture when they finally come, making dry spells drier and wet spells splashier. Hydropower schedules bend. Farmers adjust planting windows. Tourism tries to sell longer seasons and then swallows the insurance bill for one extreme rain that turns streets into rivers in October. Energy and trade join the ledger. Refineries count on stable intake salinity for cooling systems. A small shift doesn't break a plant. It shortens maintenance intervals and thickens risk margins. Ports tweak dredging schedules as suspended sediment behavior changes with denser surface layers in certain seasons. Nothing dramatic, everything cumulative. The thirsty sea doesn't shout. It leans on species, on budgets, on patience. Human rules try to help. Strict sulfur caps clean the air over coastal cities. Cleaner fuels cut soot that settles on water and seagrass. Those winds matter. They don't refill the basin. The only way that happens is the gate breathing close to normal, dense water out, fresher water in, a pulse that has matched this sea for millennia. And here's the part that turns science into stakes. If the slowdown lingers past a season, the basin's new normal gets priced into everything. Food costs, water tariffs, insurance premiums, even the timing of school holidays around heat. It's not doom, it's a tax. You pay it whether you notice or not. until someone fixes a rough lip in the dark. Ecological freefall, from blue highway to dead zones. It starts with silence, not the romantic kind, and absence. Off Almeria, a boy sits on the quay where his grandfather taught him to toss a handline for anchovies. The water should flicker at dusk. It doesn't. He leans over and sees his own face instead of baitfish scattering. You don't log that in a database, you carry it home. Under the surface, the staircase drops faster. Posidonia meadows that once swayed like underwater fields turn thin and ragged. Leaves bleach at the edges, then yellow, then fall. Where a diver's light used to spark silver among blades, it skates over a graveyard of pale stems. Juvenile fish that needed that shelter don't get a second chance. They drift into open sand, easy targets, or late recruits that never find a school. Deeper, coralligenous reefs, slow-growing, intricate scaffolds built by calcareous algae and sponges lose their gloss. Heat has been bruising them for years. Now the saltier, stratified surface keeps oxygen from flushing as often. Ledges once crowded with color turn brown and still. A camera on a transect captures a crab moving like a drunk in thin air. There isn't enough to breathe. Mortality doesn't arrive like a scythe. It accumulates like dust, then smothers. Food webs don't snap, they slip. Sardines, anchovies, and small pelagics time life to the spring bloom. With mixing windows late and weaker, larvae hit thinner soup. Survivors grow smaller and faster, a strategy that keeps a population alive but yields less bulk for nets. Predators follow the calories. Bonito and bluefish nose north or stay deeper. Gaps form where catches once felt dependable. A skipper in seat steers the same line his father ran and brings back a hold that looks like a bad joke. Jellies, a few bream, 2 plastic crates he didn't mean to trawl. Invasive species don't need a formal invitation, just an opening. Warmer summers and longer stratified spells widen that opening. Lionfish, which found a toehold through the Eastern Gate years ago, ride a friendlier thermocline west. They graze juvenile fish off reefs already thinned. Rabbitfish chew the meadows to stubble. A fisherman hauls a net and swears, not at what bit him, at what isn't there. Managers chase the moving target with rules built for yesterday. The Western Med had over 60% of stocks classified as overfished. That number wasn't news. What's new is the baseline. Reference points shift when the sea retains more heat and salt longer. Quotas set to rebuild a stock assume food and oxygen that aren't showing up in the right weeks. A council meeting in Brussels runs long. A paper arrives 2 months later explaining why recruitment failed. Nobody can issue a retroactive bloom. Meanwhile, the places that build resilience thin out. Seagrass meadows store carbon in roots and sediment. When they die back, that bank leaks. The basin's net emissions tick up a sliver. You don't feel it on your skin, you see it in charts and in the way algae rhymes rocks with a fuzzy green that sloughs under a wave. The water looks clear on postcards because the particles that should be there, living, eaten, sinking, aren't in the concentration you expect. Coastal communities absorb the shock in rituals that get renamed tradition to hide the loss. A festa moves a week earlier because late summer brings stinging blooms that wreck a swim. A market renames unfamiliar fillets to move them. A chef in Naples writes a new menu that features farmed fish and calls it innovation. He means survival. The line cook is happy for the hours. The deckhand tied up 2 shifts last week because diesel cost too much to risk a quiet net. Out in the canyons, the deep outflows cough has a body count. Without regular dense pulses, oxygen minimums spread along contour lines like a stain. Benthic sponges that filter a room's worth of water in minutes go idle. Corals close. Crustaceans tuck into crevices and wait, but the wait gets longer. Scientists log the change in trips they stretch budget to make. They lower instruments into water that smells different, an iron note where there should be clean brine. Grants don't grow as fast as the need. This freefall doesn't announce itself as collapse because people are good at coping. Fishermen run farther, switch gears, target species with looser rules. They borrow to refit. They chase rumors of a pocket that's still producing. Some land a few good weeks and buy time. Others sell a boat. None of those choices fix a gate that's exhaling less. The basin's metabolism runs hot, and everything living in it counts calories more carefully. Policy wins matter. The sulfur cap cleans air that kids breathe in Marseille and Alexandria. Fueliu cuts soot that used to dust seagrass with grit. Those are real. But a clean sky over a hungry sea is a bad trade. Without the deep renewal that only a breathing strait delivers, you get a quieter catastrophe, fewer juveniles surviving, less habitat holding, more volatility in catches, and a culture of the sea that trims its stories to fit a thinner present. The boy on the quay goes home. He asks his mother if fish move. She says they do. He doesn't know if they're leaving. He knows the water didn't answer. The coastline rewrites itself, subsidence, salt, and sinking value. Coastlines don't fall off a cliff. They sag, they settle, and then one day a house that felt inland wakes up oceanfront. When the straits exhale slows and the basin holds more salt and heat, the rewrite starts in the shallow places where people live and budgets already strain. Start with the ground itself. Many Mediterranean deltas and low coasts are built from rivers that always promised a deal, constant sediment for stability. That deal weakened as dams trapped silt upstream and groundwater pumping lowered land. Now add a sea that's warmer, slightly saltier longer, and piling more weight on the shelf with thicker surface layers. The result is subtle but steady subsidence meeting a baseline that keeps inching up. A tomato farmer outside the Ebro Delta watches his field flood at high tide more often. The map hasn't changed, the tide table has, and the soil grew heavier with salt. Salt doesn't just sit on a tongue, it walks. It seeps into groundwater, creeping up estuaries that used to push it back with strong river flow. In the Po, where irrigation has already been balancing on a knife's edge, a dry month now lets brackish fingers slip farther inland. A pump pulls water that tastes wrong. A farmer runs it anyway, then counts yellow leaves. Next season, he budgets for blended sources, plastic-lined ditches, and a new filter. The invoice is private. The consequence is public in prices at the market. Coastal utilities feel the drift first in their pipes. Desalination plants help cities ride out droughts. They also push brine back to sea. With the surface layer denser and heat lingering, dispersion changes. Engineers see it in plume models and shorten maintenance intervals on intake screens fouled by blooms that ride stratified layers longer. None of it screams disaster. It hums overtime, more electricity, more wear, more money. Ports live in this in-between zone where the built world meets shifting water. Their business is depth and time. Slightly saltier, warmer surface layers change how fine sediment stays suspended or drops. Dredging plans that ran like calendars now slip. A pilot in Valencia notes a bar that rebuilt faster than expected after a storm. Crews go out earlier than budgeted, and the invoice lands on a city desk marked urgent. The harbor doesn't care about fiscal years. Meanwhile, insurance migrates in spreadsheets. Underwriters price risk on flood maps that assumed certain tides, certain storm surges, certain river flows. A sea that retains more heat can hand storms more moisture, and a coast that sinks by millimeters per year doesn't need a new cyclone to get a new line on a map. Premiums edge up, deductibles jump. A family in Liguria had never missed a payment. The policy renewal now includes a clause that excludes saltwater intrusion damage to ground floors. They measure their living room in centimeters and move a sofa upstairs. Tourism sells a story about the coast. The story adapts quietly when the coast adapts. A beach club in the Balearics rebuilds a boardwalk a little higher. A resort in Antalya lifts pumps and electrical boxes out of basements and calls it renovation. A marina moves a fuel dock inland by a few meters and paints the old bollards. The brochure is the same, the ledger is not. There's a bureaucratic layer that decides how fast adaptation happens, and it's never as fast as the water. Land tenure, coastal setback laws, environmental permits, these are good fences against panic, but they also slow adjustments that might save a block if done now. Mayors convene meetings about resilience. The phrases are careful: nature-based solutions, dune restoration, living shorelines. Those projects work best with time and space. Apartments already sit where dunes should be. A fisherman shakes his head and says he remembers when there were more reed beds. He isn't wrong. The rewrite carries into culture without ceremony. Kitchens salt less because vegetables taste brinier. Festivals move dates because a late summer downpour turned a plaza into a canal last year. A school shifts field day from the river mouth to a stadium on higher ground after a bus got stuck on a flooded road once. Nobody prints a poster that says, "because the gate slowed." They say, "just in case." On the industrial edge, Refineries and power stations built to inhale seawater for cooling tweak intakes and materials. A small change in salinity doesn't shut a plant. It accelerates corrosion and challenges thermal efficiency. Maintenance windows creep closer. Procurement orders alloys that cost more. The spreadsheet line called water chemistry variability expands by a digit. Shareholders don't notice the code. They notice earnings shaved by slivers quarter after quarter. There's a mirror effect across the strait. In Morocco, along the Laukos and Moulaya, farmers see salt in furrows and reach the same conclusions: blend, pump, pay. A plan to tie continents with a tunnel looks bold on renderings and real in budgets. It could bind economies tighter, moving people and goods under sea whose moods already priced themselves into shipping. But binding doesn't lift ground or sweeten wells. Integration helps mobilize money and expertise. It doesn't move a sill by a centimeter. In the end, the coast doesn't fall apart. It edits itself. Lines on deeds get wet. Orchards switch varieties. Ports dredge more, pay more, and pass costs along. Insurance draws new boxes. People move not in a panic, but in a steady shuffle inland, upstairs, or away. The value that once sat on a view takes on a caveat. The sea doesn't argue. It rewrites with patience and an accountant's pen. A $10 trillion shock: trade, energy, and finance. Here's where the quiet drag becomes a balance sheet event. The strait is the hinge of a supply chain that links Atlantic factories and farms to Mediterranean ports, and then east through Suez, and back again with refined fuels, manufactured goods, and grain. When the hinge stiffens for months, the force you need to move it is money. Start with trade lanes. About 120,000 ships a year use Gibraltar. You don't need all of them delayed to move markets. You need enough to reset expectations. Container lines add days to schedules, then weeks to buffers. Freight rates for Western Med services drift up, a few $100s per box at first, then more as blank sailings stack. Retailers roll the cost into temporary logistics surcharges. A household doesn't see the strait on a receipt. It sees a higher price for sheets, a back-ordered appliance, a holiday item arriving in spring. Grain travels too. Black Sea cargoes take the Turkish Straits, but much of the milling and distribution into North Africa rides via Western Med hubs. Any persistent slowdown forces charters to reposition ships and pay premiums for reliability. Flour prices in Tunisia and Morocco don't spike overnight. They stair-step. Governments smooth it with subsidies until budgets protest. Street markets whisper the truth faster than ministries do. Energy moves through the hinge in both directions. Crude from the Atlantic and West Africa feeds Mediterranean refineries. Refined products move back. LNG swaps windows when pilots clamp down in fog or shear. Traders hate uncertainty more than cost, so they secure alternatives. Longer hauls around the Azores, different load ports, opportunistic storage. Each workaround burns fuel, and every extra day a ship sits is diesel bought at Western Med prices already nudged by higher demand. Refiners pass costs in cents. Those cents land in pumps and electricity bids. Pipelines blunt some shocks. The Med is stitched with gas lines, Algeria to Spain and Italy to the Balkans. They don't depend on ship traffic, but they depend on stable markets and maintenance windows coordinated with maritime logistics. A slow, dense exhale at Gibraltar won't shut a pipe. It will add volatility to seasonal gas balances when LNG arrivals get choppy and storage managers hedge harder. Power producers bid up gas on a hot September week because the sea ran a fever and ships were late. Consumers feel it as a higher bill with a footnote about global conditions. Finance prices all of this in real time. Insurers adjust warily, higher premiums for transits during adverse windows, tighter clauses for cargo delay. A basis point here, a basis point there. Insurers live in that world, but manufacturers don't. They chase working capital sucked into inventory that now sits longer. A car plant in Spain carries extra parts because trains from Atlantic gateways miss slots. That inventory has a cost of capital attached, and CFOs count it. Port authorities publish throughput dips and blame conditions. Bond markets read between lines. If a port's revenues sag while operating costs rise, more dredging, more overtime, more pilotage flexibility, its paper trades with a fresh discount. Municipal budgets that leaned on port dividends tighten. Mayors delay projects that had nothing to do with the sea and tell voters it's fiscal prudence. It's the Strait. NATO watches chokepoints to keep lanes open against deliberate threats, and that deterrence calms markets on a geopolitical axis. But no carrier strike group can flatten roughness on a sill. Security premiums and hybrid risk chatter show up anyway. A rumor about sabotage spikes an index for a day, then fades. The real risk is the boring one, weeks of slippage that add up to quarters of drag. The shipping industry has playbooks. Pandemic lessons in 202 taught dual sourcing, nearshoring where it made sense, and diversifying gateways. Those tactics help, but they shift, not remove cost. Rail from Atlantic ports into Europe can't expand overnight. Drivers still have hours, customs still has desks. The reroute tax lands in margins. Venture money that once chased just-in-time efficiency now prices optionality. That sounds strategic. It looks like higher prices and fewer choices on shelves. Environmental regulation isn't the villain, but it's in the math. The 0.1% sulfur cap in the Mediterranean cleans the air and cuts health costs. It also means ships don't switch to cheaper, lower-quality fuels to make up lost time. Fuel-use onshore power rules shave emissions at birth. Compliance adds fixed costs when ships dwell. Good policy, but it trims sloppy workarounds. Markets prefer clean constraints they can price. They can price these. They still pay. Added up, a year of persistent friction through Gibraltar becomes a global bill measured in trillions because it touches every rung. Containerized trade, bulk food and fertilizers, refined fuels, LNG timing, port finance, utility hedging, insurance, and retail pricing. Not every cent traces to the sill. Enough does that the sill becomes a line item in models. Traders name it. Ministers avoid it. Households live with it. The shock isn't a thunderclap. It's a metronome ticking faster. Every beat moves money from someone's pocket to keep the hinge moving. And still, offshore, the horns keep time. Can we reopen the gate, engineering the unthinkable? The horns don't fix rock. So what would? Not a tugboat, not a press conference. If the sill's new skin is the break, the job is simple to describe and hard to do. Reduce roughness at the crest, restore a clean path for the dense tongue, and let the basin exhale. That means seeing the problem, choosing a tool, and working in a river of heavy water 280 meters down without making it worse. First, you have to see. The strait already carries instruments, but in a slowdown you'd surge a swarm. Multi-beam sonars to map microtopography on the crest, side scan to trace fresh drapes, and bottom landers to read turbulence, shear, and net transport. Think of a CAT scan done while the patient jogs. Gliders nose along the density jump, tasting salt, temperature, and oxygen. Moorings strung like harp strings across the channel report internal wave, timing, and amplitude. You're not guessing at roughness, you're drawing it grain by grain. Then comes the choice no one wants to make lightly: touch the crest or leave it. Models suggest small reductions in roughness can flip the system back to attached flow. The wrong touch can kick a slope into motion. Engineers would stage tests on the edges, localized trials where the dense plume isn't strongest, using tools the offshore industry knows. Low-pressure water jets to peel fine drapes, suction frames to vacuum mobile sand into skips, and grout-filled mattresses to pin loose patches without raising the crest. You're not dredging a channel, you're smoothing a knuckle. Work windows are the next constraint. The dense layer surges and ebbs on tides you can predict but not fully control. Operations would ride those lows when shear is least, like climbers moving between gusts. ROVs do the hands, with manipulators fitted for soft touch. DP vessels hold station on the surface, pilots and tugs thread them in and out between traffic. The job runs at night if that's when the plume lets go gently. Every hour costs. Every mistake costs more. Could you add flow instead of removing roughness? In theory, yes. Think of anchored, low-profile flow straighteners, like veins laid across a patchy crest to guide the plume. The risk is clutter in a channel that hates it. Anything proud of the bed catches eddies and grows biofilm. Better to go low and smooth than add ribs that might sing in the current. What about blasting? No, you can't bomb your way to lamina. Explosives fracture rock, liberate fines, and turn a break into a landslide. Salvage taught the 195 Suez cleanup patience and leverage, not brute force. Here, leverage looks like physics-based triage. Identify the few square meters doing the most harm and give them back their sheen. The legal layer sits over all of this like a second tide. Two nations' waters, a British overseas territories lanes, and a sea designated a sulfur ECA. Any intervention threads UNCLOS duties, Barcelona Convention protocols, and port state control. UD needs Spain, Morocco, the UK, and Gibraltar authorities, the EU, and observers who speak for the region's environment. A NATO presence would monitor security and safety. It wouldn't run the job. The fastest path is a joint tasking framed as emergency maintenance of a shared artery, with explicit guardrails, minimum footprint, environmental monitoring, rollback if metrics worsen. Monitoring would be the spine. Before, during, after, moored ADCPs reading currents at multiple depths, turbulence microstructure profilers measuring dissipation, and dye releases at depth tracing attachment over the crest. Gliders would patrol continuously, feeding assimilation models that forecast internal tide timing and best work windows. Success isn't a press photo, it's a change in plots, less wasted energy, more net transport west. Could we buy time another way? Reroute traffic harder, move more cargo overland, fly time-critical loads. That's the playbook and it bleeds. What about boosting exhale by increasing evaporation deficits elsewhere? You can't wish a basin thinner. Could upstream freshwater management help? Rivers are already rationed. The fix lives at the sill or in the calendar. Wait for winter storms to scour naturally. If the waiting costs trillions and the scour doesn't come, waiting is a choice, not a plan. There's a softer layer. Reduce the basin's burden while the gate is sticky. Enforce the sulfur cap tightly to keep air clearer for coastal health under heat stress. Expand marine protected areas to give nurseries slack. Fund seagrass restoration so meadows that survive trap sediment and stabilize nearshore dynamics. Those winds don't open the gate, but they keep the patient stronger until the exhale returns. The hardest part is humility. Models suggest targeted smoothing could work. They also flag risks. You stage, you measure, you stop if the plume detaches more. You tell the public the truth. This is surgery on a beating heart. You keep the team small and the oversight broad. And you accept that success looks boring. Pilots logging, currents normal, moorings whispering transport up, fishermen tasting surface water and saying fresh again. No ribbon, no statue. Just a gate breathing closer to normal. The Messinian memory, when the Med went dry, history as warning. 3 million years is far, but the rock keeps receipts. Long before anyone argued over borders or sulfur caps, the Mediterranean faced a gate problem that didn't nudge, it snapped. Geologists call it the Messinian salinity crisis. In their shorthand, the Atlantic connection narrowed, the balance broke, and the basin turned from a sea into a patchwork of hypersaline lakes and salt flats. You can read that story in cliffs of gypsum and halite stacked like pages. It isn't a myth. It's a layer cake you can touch. Here's the spine of it, stripped of romance. The Mediterranean always loses more water to evaporation than it gets from rivers and rain. It survives by trading salt for fresh, dense brine out at depth, lighter Atlantic water in at the surface. Change the geometry at the gate enough, and that trade fails. In the late Miocene, tectonics squeezed and lifted thresholds across what's now the strait. The connection weakened in steps. Exchange throttled. Evaporation won. Over thousands of years, sea level inside the basin dropped by hundreds of meters. Rivers cut canyons where blue water sits now. The Nile scoured a trench deep into bedrock. When the door reopened in the Zanclean flood, the refill rushed like a planet resetting a lung. No, we're not about to stage the sequel. Nobody's forecasting a modern sea slumping into a salt pan. But the physics rhyme, and rhymes matter. The Messinian reminds us that this basin's metabolism lives on a margin. As long as the exhale clears and the inhale keeps pace, life stacks complexity. When the exhale stalls, salt accumulates. When the inhale thins, heat lingers. That drift doesn't need a canyon-carving low stand to hurt. It needs stubborn roughness on a sill and years of slightly altered budgets. The direction is the same, towards salinity ratcheting up, oxygen sagging, and ecosystems losing slack. You can walk across southern Spain and see the warning pinned in stone. Evaporites crop out like scars. Cores pulled from the deep carry lovely, brutal evidence. Layers of salt crystals grown in brine pools, then buried, then deformed by the weight of younger seas. Those salts still move, creeping as diapias, pushing into sediments above. Even today, that slow salt tectonics tilts patches of seabed and alters local topography along the margins. It's a long echo from a short phrase. The gate closed enough for long enough that the whole basin rewrote itself, then spent millions of years settling. There's a human translation baked into those rocks. When the trade fails, rivers carve deeper to meet a falling base level. Coastlines leap seaward. Habitats that knit together the food web, estuaries, deltas, shallow shelves, vanish or migrate far from the old lines. When water returns, it doesn't rebuild what was there. It builds what the new geometry allows. That's the stakes behind our tidy words about exchange and roughness. We're not balancing a spreadsheet. We are holding the shape of lives that grew around a sea that breathes. Scientists got to the Messinian through puzzles that felt familiar. Why are marine fossils missing from certain intervals? Why are there thick salt layers in a place that should be open ocean? Why do seismic surveys show odd, reflective sheets draped across the deep? Piece by piece, they built a picture of a marginal world, straits narrowing, thresholds lifting, circulation failing. It's a forensic lesson in compounding small shifts. The catastrophic fill at the end grabbed headlines. The grind before it wrote the quiet tragedy. Now fold that memory into today without scaring yourself into stupor. Our thresholds sit lower relative to global sea level. Tides and storms score the sill differently. Human hands can measure, model, and maybe nudge. But our vulnerabilities rhyme with late Miocene ones. The basin's evaporation deficit is bigger in a warming climate. Rivers arrive smaller and flashier. The two-layer conveyor lives close to a critical state over the Camarinal Sill. If you throttle the exhale for a season, you get inconvenience and cost. If you throttle it for years, you start stacking a geologic argument in slow motion. That's why the sober talk about maintenance of a shared artery sounds grand for a rough patch of rock. It is grand because the rock remembers a time when the artery constricted past saving and the patient survived by becoming something else. We don't need that lesson in full to feel the edge of it. You can see its first syllables in meadows thinning, in oxygen biting deeper at night, in a fisherman's ledger that refuses to balance with diesel at new prices and catches at new lows. There's one more line the Messinian draws for us. Nature loves thresholds. Cross them, and returning takes more than undoing the last step. Hysteresis lives in seas. Once salt builds and deep waters go stale, it takes stronger winters and longer windows to reverse. In the Messinian, reversal needed tectonics and a flood. Today, reversal means physics we can influence, smoothing a sill, giving nurseries slack, enforcing clean air rules that lighten stress. The stakes aren't a dry basin. They're a living one with less resilience or more. The memory in stone votes for more attention at the gate. Geopolitics at the edge of a closed sea. When a sea runs a fever, politics sweats. The slowdown at Gibraltar doesn't redraw borders, but it redraws the patience that holds them. Start with the daily hinge, Gibraltar's frontier. After June 2025, dual controls at the port and airport kept life fluid. Spanish Schengen checks paired with Gibraltar's own authority. That quiet fix matters now. Pilots, tug crews, customs officers, medics, people who make a chokepoint breathe, move faster. A policy that once felt technical becomes the difference between minutes and hours when minutes compound into costs. Across La Linea, Spanish politics carries a second rhythm. Madrid talks integration and resilience, then here's a chorus from the benches that want the rock back in speeches, if not in plans. A non-binding motion plays to a headline. On the quay, dockers shrug. They want shifts, not symbolism. Gibraltar's government reads the moment carefully. Sovereignty lines hold, cooperation deepens, and the port stays open for business. That balance is fragile when horns never stop. Look south and the chessboard gets bigger. Spain and Morocco talk an undersea tunnel, a 40-kilometer idea that promises trains under the strait and a shared prosperity zone. In a normal year, it's vision. In a slow year, it's leverage. Grants, guarantees, and the politics of whose crews build what, all of it sits next to migration pressure around Ceuta and Melilla. Morocco has learned the power of grey zone moves, flows at fences, paperwork delays, a quiet hand on the tap of cooperation. Spain has learned to answer with investment and diplomacy, not just patrols. A sticky strait raises the value of calm on both sides. NATO doesn't patrol Salinity, but it does patrol the narrative. The alliance's playbook in the Mediterranean is to keep lanes secure, cables watched, and exercises visible enough to calm insurers without spooking neighbors. Russian ships loitering in the eastern basin, hybrid chatter about a mysterious incident on a cable, a drone sighting near a pipeline. These stories spike when trade is tight because markets crave a villain with a face. NATO's presence says, not this time. It can't smooth a sill, but it can smooth nerves. The EU narrows gaps with rules and money. FuelEU tightens clean operations. Cohesion funds back rail and port links to Atlantic gateways. Emergency corridors move perishable goods faster across borders. Brussels frames it as resilience, not retreat. Member states still argue rail paths, customs staffing, who pays overtime, yet the machine grinds toward coordination because voters hate empty shelves and high bills. The sulfur ECA's enforcement holds. Nobody wants a race to the bottom on fuel quality to shave hours. That discipline costs today and saves tomorrow's lungs. Legal frameworks keep tempers from becoming incidents. UNCLOS, the Barcelona Convention, Port State Control, all the dull acronyms that keep captains, coast guards, and ministries in a shared conversation. A Spanish patrol boat edges near British Gibraltar territorial waters. A Royal Navy cutter shadows. Radios stay civil because everyone knows markets are listening. The script avoids escalation because it has to. A misstep in a week like this would snowball into premiums nobody can afford. Energy diplomacy rides quietly beneath. Algerian gas through Medgaz and Transmed hums with new importance when LNG arrivals slip. Italy leans into contracts. Spain hedges storage. North African producers weigh price against long-term trust. A lumpy LNG schedule from a sticky strait makes pipelines the adult in the room. That bargaining power shows up in clauses, not tweets. Meanwhile, refiners bid for reliability. Crude swaps and product trades reroute like water, seeking a lower path. Fisheries policy meets reality on the quay. The Western Med already had too many red lights on overfishing. Now the environment tilts. Ministers know a quota cut will hurt. They also know dead stocks don't vote. Marine protected areas expand where they can, enforcement sharpens where politics allows, and crews line up for buyouts that feel like funerals. Conservation NGOs speak the language of good environmental status, and for once it lands. People can inhale the sulfur cap's benefits. They can see meadows thin. They can count fewer boxes on a deck. Geopolitics runs on narratives, and the straight story is easy to twist. Weaponized choke points, maritime blackmail, foreign meddling. The truth is messier and more boring. A rocky steppe, a two-layer river, and a basin with an evaporation habit. Still, leaders will be tempted to point, not fix. The hard path is coordination. Spain, Morocco, the UK and Gibraltar authorities, the EU, and a ring of coastal states agreeing on monitoring, sharing data, and if needed, touching the crest lightly under the world's gaze. That takes trust that survives a headline. There's a small window for smart bets. Fund the moorings and gliders that make the invisible visible. Train more pilots. Harden undersea cables and map redundancy. Pre-clear rail corridors from Atlantic ports for when the hinge sticks again. Put fisheries on a climate footing, adaptive quotas, real enforcement, cash for transition. Pay coastal towns to move critical kit upstairs before the next autumn deluge. None of this makes a speech soar, all of it makes a sea livable. While the horns drone, a quiet meeting in Brussels runs long. A colonel briefs undersea risks in Naples. A mayor in Tangier signs a permit for a new cold store. A Gibraltarian pilot scribbles, currents odd, and keeps a ship straight. That's geopolitics at the edge of a closed sea, less theater, more tide. Aftermath and adaptation, living with a scarred Mediterranean. When the gate finally breathes closer to normal, there isn't a cheer. There's a slackening. Pilots write fewer notes. Currents odd becomes currents fine. AIS tracks thread east smoother. Rates soften by inches. In fishermen's mouths, surface water tastes a shade less sharp. That's as close as you get to a ribbon cutting here. But scars don't vanish because flow improved. Budgets that stretch for months don't rebound overnight. Ports keep the overtime rosters a little thicker. Insurers don't lower premiums because of a good week. A hospital pharmacist still staggers orders, building a buffer nobody sees. The adaptation starts as small, boring choices that add up to a different sea life contract. Cities learn to assume volatility. Utilities fund extra intake screens, not because salinity will spike tomorrow, but because the last round of fouling arrived faster than models said. Coastal managers build playbooks tied to strait state like they do for heat waves, conserve earlier, release later, and watch telemetry that used to sit in academic dashboards. It's a culture shift, less hand-waving, more thresholds. Fisheries don't bounce, they limp. Managers who already wrestled over quotas now account for timing that moved and nurseries that thinned. Adaptive plans replace fixed calendars, closures keyed to oxygen and temperature triggers, not dates. It feels fussy until a year class lives that would have died. Crews hate the paperwork and love a deck with more than jellies. Buyouts expand for gears that punish habitats under stress. A skipper who built identity on a specific net gets paid to change it. He signs with a frown and a plan to keep his kid in school. Seagrass restoration stops being a grant fad and becomes infrastructure. Divers staple biodegradable anchors into sand, laying down chutes like stitches. It's slow work that pays twice, habitat back for juveniles and sediment pinned in place when storms roll. Some beds fail under heat, others catch and spread. Towns start naming them like they name parks. There's pride there that wasn't a decade ago. Monitoring steps out of the lab. Moorings at the Sill stream real-time to public dashboards. Gliders tweet their tracks. Weather apps don't bother, port apps do. A Gibraltarian pilot swipes through plots before a shift. A farmer inland checks a salinity forecast the way her grandfather checked the sky. Schools take kids to see the instrument mast at the quay and tell them it's as important as the lighthouse. It is. Policy learns to move with fewer apologies. Port state control keeps sulfur enforcement tight. Cleaner air isn't a luxury when summers run hotter. Fuel use onshore power pushes ports to wire faster. Crews plug in and sleep in quieter decks. That kind of adaptation doesn't open the gate, it shrinks collateral damage when it sticks. Meanwhile, the legal scaffolding around intervention at depth gets written in peacetime, not crisis. A joint protocol that says who can touch what, with what tools, under what monitoring, and how you stop if the plots tilt the wrong way. Trade rewrites itineraries with humility. Lines lock in more Atlantic gateway capacity and buy rail paths a season ahead. Governments grease customs where corridors will surge in the next slowdown. Truckers get paid to wait less and drive smarter. That doesn't sound like adaptation. It's exactly that, time cut from places where it used to evaporate. Migration policy learns the rhythm too. When logistics sag, pressure at fences goes up. Spain and Morocco staff crossings with lawyers as well as guards. Nobody advertises that, but fewer panicked scenes at gates burn less oxygen in politics. The undersea tunnel stays on paper a little longer, while everyone counts what a slower strait actually costs. Tourism becomes honest. Beach towns sell seasons, but they sell timing, too, early mornings when blooms are asleep, afternoons after storms when the sea breathes. They post water quality fast and stop pretending a bad day isn't a bad day. Visitors trust a place that tells the truth and comes back for the good weeks. And then there's the money. Bonds for port upgrades and coastal defenses get tied to strait resilience metrics, monitoring installed, dredging plans adaptive, emergency corridors pre-cleared. Investors learn to read those lines. Town councils learn to write them into projects that make sense even if the gate behaves for a decade. You'll hear a new phrase in Brussels and Naples, maintenance of the artery. It's not romantic. It's a budget line that buys sonar hours, ROV time, and the people who know how to point them. Smoothing a knuckle at depth becomes like clearing snow in a mountain pass, rare, careful, supervised, and not a scandal. The win shows up in fewer emails that say, "Come back tomorrow." Most of adaptation lives under the level of a headline. A warehouse stocks an extra week of reagents. A power plant replaces a screen before it clogs. A council funds a reef that keeps a meadow from tearing. A pilot turns 5 minutes saved into a safe landing. The gate still breathes. The basin still leans. We learn to live with a scar and keep it from widening. The final shift is cultural. People stop treating the strait like scenery and start treating it like infrastructure. They ask who maintains it. They vote for budgets that fund the boring parts. They don't wait for horns to sound wrong before they care. And when the gate sticks again, and it will, they don't panic. They work the plan. Climate feedbacks when a sea stops exhaling. When the exhale weakens, The sea keeps its heat and passes the tab to the sky. Start with the skin. A slightly saltier, warmer surface holds on to warmth longer into night, and evaporation rises because the air above can take more. Climate models suggest that extra latent heat flux loads passing systems with moisture. The paradox shows up in diaries: longer dry spells, then rain that arrives like a decision instead of a conversation. Storms notice first. The Mediterranean's winter cyclones usually spin up when cold continental air rakes over warm water. With a thicker warm layer and less deep renewal, climate models suggest you get more fuel near the surface, but less vertical help from mixing. Some lows deepen fast and dump hard over tight corridors: Liguria, parts of Catalonia, the Ionian, then move on. Others fade because the cap holds and the atmosphere can't bite through. Forecasters earn their pay in the gap between those outcomes, and planners hedge both ways. Flood barriers up more often, reservoirs held lower just in case. The heat doesn't only power rain, it edits seasons. Autumn lingers, shoulder months stretch. Tourism departments celebrate, then read the fine print from insurers warning about late-season cloudbursts. Farmers count the cost of dry Septembers that demand extra irrigation and October downpours that rot fruit in place. Climate models suggest the subtropical jet's moisture branch feeding into Western Europe could nudge north or kink into cutoff lows more often when the basin runs warm and saline. The word planners use is variability. Families call it whiplash. Upstream, mountains answer slowly. The Alps and Pyrenees accumulate snow from a ballet of air masses and sea-sourced moisture. Warmer shoulder seasons thin the freeze window. A November that used to stack snow now rains to mid-elevation. Hydropower schedules wobble. Water that used to arrive as a spring melt pulses in winter peaks and spring deficits. Managers reshape playbooks, store earlier when storms hit, spill carefully when a warm spell threatens rain on snow. A ski town posts a new map. Lifts creep higher, and a meadow that once held a sledge run grows broom. Energy planners translate this into megawatts and hours. Cooling demand hangs on into October as the sea's warm grip slows nighttime relief in coastal cities. Heating demand snaps on later, but arrives in sharper bursts when cold shots finally punch through. Grid operators adjust maintenance windows. A substation that used to sleep in October now stays awake for air conditioners and dehumidifiers. Gas bids see the pattern: late peaks, uneven troughs, and storage strategies chase it, made jumpier when LNG arrivals slip under a sticky strait. The ocean answers the ocean. The Mediterranean exports its saltier signature to the Atlantic at mid-depths, seasoning, not steering, the larger circulation. Slow the deep outflow and you dial down that salt leak west. Over years, studies suggest nearby Atlantic layers could freshen slightly, nudging stratification along Iberia and the Bay of Biscay. That matters where upwelling feeds fisheries and where storms draw energy from sea-air temperature contrasts. It's not a switch, it's a slider. Fishermen feel it as shifts in wear and when a line pays. Atmospheric rivers stitch the pieces together. When the basin runs warm and the gate's exhale is weak, models suggest the integrated vapor transport into Europe can carry a Mediterranean accent farther inland, narrow, intense swathes that test levees in the Rhone and Po basins and flash small tributaries not built for that rhythm. Meanwhile, long high-pressure spells trap pollution over cities that just benefited from sulfur caps at sea. Clean ship fuel helped, stagnant domes still hurt lungs. Feedback loops live in the dark, too. Stratification keeps oxygen-poor water under a thicker lid, microbes that chew on what sinks, belching nutrients that wait for a mixing event. When a late storm finally stirs layers, it can trigger blooms that look like a gift and then crash into hypoxia along coasts if calm returns. Managers write new rules keyed to thresholds: no dredging, no big outfalls, when oxygen dips below lines that didn't matter before. It's fussy government. It saves fish. Coasts take the punch differently. Microbursts fueled by loaded boundary layers drop rain that urban drains can't swallow. Streets in Marseille, Valencia, and Palermo flood on days that weren't supposed to be dangerous. Municipal crews lift grates and curse. The next budget cycle funds bigger pipes and green roofs. The same sea that paid for sunsets now charges for gutters. All this sits on top of trends already in motion: Rising global sea level, shrinking river flows, hotter summers. A sticky gate doesn't create them, it leans on them. Climate models suggest the lean is regional and cumulative, not cinematic. No headline will call it the Gibraltar effect. You'll see it in parking lots converted to detention basins, in reservoir rules rewritten, in insurance policies with new riders for pluvial flood, in schools calling off a trip because an October storm ate a road. There's a way to lower the volume while we fix the beat. Fund the observing spine, moorings on the sill, gliders along the density jump, satellites watched by people with time to look. Publish a straight state index that ports, farmers, and grid operators can use like a tide table. Keep ECA enforcement tight to clear the air while heat waves stack. Protect nurseries so the food web has slack when storms and calms misfire. None of this flips a switch. It trims the peaks and fills the troughs enough that a family's month doesn't hinge on a sea's mood. The feedback message is blunt. When a sea stops exhaling cleanly, the weather reads it. If the models are right, the signal won't shout. It will persist. The choice is whether we notice soon enough to change what we can before calendars, budgets, and habits rewrite themselves for us. What we can do before the gate sticks, policy and foresight. Start with a truth that isn't thrilling. Prevention looks like maintenance and measurements. If you want a sea to breathe, you fund the things that make it legible. That means an observing spine across the strait, moorings on the Camarinal Sill reading currents and turbulence at multiple depths, gliders patrolling the density jump, multi-beam surveys of the crest twice a year, and satellites watched by analysts with time to notice pattern changes. Don't bury the plots in journals. Publish a public straight state index the way we publish pollen counts. Green, yellow, red, with guidance for pilots, port captains, grid operators, and farmers. You can't fix what you can't see. Next, write the rules before the crisis. A joint protocol for maintenance of the artery needs to exist on paper with signatures. Spain, Morocco, the UK and Gibraltar authorities, the EU, and an environmental watchdog under the Barcelona Convention. It should define when a slowdown crosses from weather to intervention, who calls it, what tools are allowed, soft touch smoothing, no blasting, how monitoring verifies benefit, and what the stop conditions are if metrics tilt the wrong way. Fold port state control and ACA enforcement into the same governance, so clean air isn't traded for speed when people get nervous. Ports are the hinge on land. Build slack where it pays back most. Pre-clear rail corridors from Atlantic gateways into Europe for use during red weeks. Staff customs to surge without chaos. Invest in cold chain nodes inland so perishable cargo can pivot without dying on a quay. Fund pilot training and fatigue management tied to internal tide forecasts. A rested pilot with the right window is cheap insurance. Tie port bond financing to resilience metrics. Observing gear installed. Adaptive dredging plans. Emergency corridors drilled, so money flows to places that can show readiness. The shipping industry already learned hard lessons. Lock them in. Incentivize scheduling buffers on Western Med services during seasonal risk windows. Reward lines that keep reliability above a threshold with port fee rebates that match the public interest in steadier flow. Encourage alliances to share vessels for reliability during straight red weeks rather than running parallel strings that all fail together. Require contingency plans for medical supply chains, named alternate gateways, air bridge contracts, warehouse capacity pre-booked, so the hospital email that says, "Come back tomorrow" becomes rare. Food and water need their own playbooks. Ministries should build grain and flour buffers in North Africa and Southern Europe sized for a month of slow shipping, not a week, and rotate them transparently. Support irrigation districts in the Po, Ebro, and Guadalquivir with salinity early warning and funding for blending infrastructure before wells go brackish. Subsidize on-farm storage and resilient varieties now, not as disaster relief later. Desalination keeps cities alive. Invest in smarter brine dispersion and intake screens to keep plants efficient when the surface runs warm and dense. None of that opens the gate. All of it shrinks the tax when it sticks. Fisheries need room to breathe. Move from rigid calendars to adaptive closures keyed to oxygen and temperature thresholds that monitoring can verify. Expand marine protected areas where connectivity matters most for nurseries, Posidonia meadows, coralligenous reefs, and fund enforcement with real boats and real salaries. Pair rules with transition cash, buyouts for gears that scar habitats under stress, grants for switching to selective methods, and training for aquaculture that doesn't worsen local salinity or oxygen problems. Put scientists on the quay, paid to brief crews in plain language about timing shifts they can fish with, not against. Energy planners should assume messy seasons, write gas storage rules for late heat and sharp cold snaps, coordinate LNG schedules with straight-state forecasts, pre-contract flexible swaps so one bad week doesn't cascade into price spikes. Refineries and power plants can harden cooling systems against small salinity drifts, materials, screen upgrades, maintenance windows shifted out of likely red weeks. Tie grid maintenance to seasonal strait risk. Don't take a substation down when the sea says keep cooling on. Then there's the boring, vital work of cooperation. NATO and the EU can keep cables watched and exercises visible enough to calm nerves, but the heart of this is civilian: hydrographers, pilots, oceanographers, fisheries officers, port engineers. Build a standing Gibraltar exchange, a small, permanent cell in Algeciras and Tangier Med with seats for all sides that meets every week, not just in storms. Share data without theatrics. Practice a 72-hour smoothing drill with ROVs on the edge of the crest under full environmental monitoring, then publish the results. Trust is a habit, not a press release. Citizens get a lane too. Support the teams that watch the water. Vote for budgets that fund observing gear, coastal science, and clean fuels enforcement. Ask your utility and your port what their straight plan is. If they don't have one, keep asking until they do. If you run a business that depends on timely imports, medical, food, components, map your alternate gateways and share that map with your suppliers. The strait is infrastructure. Treat it that way. Finally, protect the patient while you prep the operating room. Keep sulfur caps tight in the new ECA. Clean air buys health when heat stacks. Restore seagrass to pin sediment and rebuild nurseries. Move critical kit upstairs in flood-prone towns before the next autumn deluge. It's not heroic. It's how you earn quiet when the horns sound wrong. This gate is geology with a budget. Ignore it, and it taxes everything quietly, relentlessly. Support the people who keep it breathing, fund the monitors, back clean fuel enforcement, and demand straight plans from ports, utilities, and suppliers. Then keep going with us for the next chokepoint story that links Suez, the Turkish Straits, and undersea cables. Hit play and subscribe.